Welcome everyone to our special panel on climate and security. I'm Alex Pearce, Campaigns Director at the Climate Council. Today I'm joined by Mr. Doug Sonnek, Acting Deputy Chief of Mission from the US Embassy in Canberra, Ms. Cheryl Durrant, former Director of Defence Preparedness for the Australian Defence Force and Climate Councillor, and Dr. Robert Glasser, Head of the Climate and Security Policy Centre at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land in which I work and live, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. I also extend this respect to traditional owners of the land from where you're all dialing in from, and I want to welcome any First Nations people on our call today. This evening, we're lucky to be joined by some of Australia's leading experts in climate change and security. We'll have about an hour together and we've received hundreds of questions from our community in advance of our panel. So these have been woven into the discussion as we go. If you have additional questions, feel free to add them to the comments section and our team behind the scenes will respond. I'll ask all our panelists tonight to keep your answers relatively brief as we've got a lot of content that we want to move through. The Black Summer fires are still fresh in the memories of many Australians, whilst around the world we've seen devastating flooding in China, fires in Greece and Canada, hurricanes hitting the US, and record droughts in Brazil. In August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published the most important climate science update for almost a decade. It found that climate change and its impacts are accelerating faster than we thought, with heat waves, droughts, floods, heavy downpours, and other extreme events getting worse, driven by the burning of coal, oil, and gas. Not only are these worsening extreme weather events devastating communities, economies, and livelihoods, climate change poses a significant and growing threat to human and societal well-being. It's threatening our food, water, health, and our national security. This morning, the Climate Council has released a report that found climate change will increase the risk of conflict, and Australia will not find lasting national security without adequately addressing climate change. It also found Australia must act rapidly and decisively on climate change in order to maintain the collective security of the Asia-Pacific region. As Australia and US's foreign and defence ministers meet for talks this week, we've brought together this panel to unpack just how climate change is a security threat, how our allies like the US are leading the way, and what Australia must do to tackle the substantial climate and security risks on our doorstep. So good evening, panellists. Let's dive in. Let's first look at how climate change is driving security threats and what kind of impacts we can expect to see in our region. So Cheryl, I'll start with you. Congratulations on the launch of the Climate Council's report this morning. In the report, you flagged that Australia faces substantial climate and security risks. What do these risks look like for Australia and why should Aussies be concerned?
Well, thanks, Alex. And I guess the first takeaway, the big takeaway is climate change is a risk amplifier, or as the security community have described it, a threat multiplier. So not only do we see the fires, the floods, the droughts that we're already experiencing today, but those things deliver shocks to livelihoods, and those communities who've suffered bushfires can certainly relate to this, or suffered floods. They deliver economic shocks as well. And as these shocks continue to escalate, as climate events become more frequent and more severe, over time, our capacity to cope becomes less. And I think with COVID, we're already, some of us, understanding what an ongoing event, a long duration event means to capacity to cope. And if we still don't address those shocks now in the economic and food and water space, well, then they can flow across borders. And that's where you have the potential for climate change to escalate into conflict.
And Cheryl, we're getting a lot of questions from our audience about how these risks escalate over the next 5, 10, 30 years. How do you understand those risks to be escalating in the future?
Well, I think we've already seen, we have in the military, and I was there, a sort of joke that every year we have Operation Deny Christmas. So there's pressures on response forces, including the military, are just getting higher and higher, but also pressures on infrastructure, recovery, and a whole lot of things. How it plays out in the 5, 10, 30 years is really dependent on what we do now. If we're going to build resilience into infrastructure, we can't wait 5, 10 or 30 years. We need to do it now. So it's one of those open-ended questions. If we act now and act decisively, we'll avoid the worst of the effects. If we don't, we're not heading towards a good future.
And I might throw to you, Doug, just to build on that point. I know you have an economic background as well. What do you see as sort of the costs over the longer term if we don't address this climate security threat?
Well, thanks, Alex, for the opportunity to be here with this great panel today and talking about these important issues. The costs run along a whole continuum of effects, both to our societies and to our militaries. First, we look at the increasing temperatures effects on agriculture, on productivity, coastal inundation, weather events that are already costing the United States hundreds of billions of dollars. And that is at the present rate of carbon in the atmosphere. And the trajectory we are on is to only get worse. The Swiss reinsurance giant Swiss Re has calculated that this could be as much as $20 trillion globally by 2050. So the economic costs to our countries can be staggering. But that includes within it a subset of costs to our militaries, both directly and to the readiness of our forces. For the United States, for example, we have seen weather events like Hurricane Michael inflict billions of dollars of damage to US military facilities like Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, or flooding in the Midwest. And that doesn't even touch on the costs associated with how we adjust to a different geostrategic environment. For example, looking at the thawing of the Arctic, that requires a whole new way of thinking about where our forces are deployed around the world. And the costs of that are really quite considerable as well.
Those costs are staggering, and I'm sure many of our audiences will be surprised to hear that they're in the billions and trillions, depending on how you measure it. And of course, there are other costs too, including in our region. And Robert, I know that you released a report earlier this year which found that within a decade, as the climate continues to warm, the strategic environment, particularly in maritime Southeast Asia, which is obviously a region that's very important to Australia, will begin to unravel. Could you tell us a bit more about what those sort of security implications could look like in our own backyard?
Sure, yes, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I wrote that report primarily because the discussion about climate in Australia tends to focus on the climate impacts in Australia, and the climate impacts overseas are just happening over there as if that's unconnected to us, when in fact, their problems, arguably the problems of maritime Southeast Asia from climate change, could affect Australia as much, potentially even more than the domestic impacts of climate change. And that's because if you think about maritime Southeast Asia, 400 million people on predominantly low-lying island states, 275 million of those people in Indonesia alone. It's just a couple hundred kilometers from Australia, from Cape York to Indonesia. So these are problems on our doorstep that are emerging rapidly now. We are, unlike many other wealthy countries, we are in a neighborhood, are in a region of many near neighbor, less developed countries. They're vulnerable in terms of the hazards. The hazards are, climate hazards are amplifying in the region and in fact disproportionately affecting the region. For example, sea level is rising 4 times faster than the global average in maritime Southeast Asia, which means that what is currently a 1 in 100 year extreme flooding event will become annual events within little more than a decade in many parts of Indonesia and other parts of the sub-region. I think if you look at cyclone risk is increasing. If you look at El Nino and La Nina events, the former is extreme heat and drought, the latter extreme flooding and cyclone risk. Those, science says that those are increasing in severity and intensity, both El Nino and La Nina. Extreme El Nino events will double in frequency within little less than a decade. And when you look at the world and the impact El Niños and La Niñas have on the world, there are many places affected, but nowhere with the dense concentration of people on low-lying island communities as exists in maritime Southeast Asia. You put all that together, the food, the fact that fisheries catches are dropping at record levels in this immediate region. You add the geological risk, because this region is also part of the Ring of Fire. You have earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and you see that there's absolutely enormous exposure in this region, and both hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, because many of these countries have virtually no social safety nets for the informal sector. Agriculture is predominantly rain-fed in places like Indonesia, and countries of the region, including Indonesia, have histories of close links between food insecurity and political instability historically. So very huge risks and challenges, of course, for them, but especially also for their neighbors, and including Australia.
That is a very sobering snapshot, Robert, of how climate change and security interact in our region, and makes it feel very close to home. I think it also drives home the importance that this challenge is so large. We need to collaborate. And I might go to you, Doug. I believe it's the 70 years of the ANZUS Security Alliance. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how Australia and the US could perhaps face this large security threat collaboratively, and how perhaps our countries could work together to tackle climate change.
No, thanks, Alex. Yeah, Australia and the United States are absolutely critical partners in putting the globe on a sustainable climate pathway. And this is a topic that our leaders have spoken about in their interactions. And as a global security challenge, this will be something that is, as Minister Dutton said recently in a remarks to the American Chamber of Commerce, that this is going to be on the agenda when Minister Dutton and Minister Payne traveled to Washington for the AusMin ministerial meetings on the 16th of September. So the United States is urging all countries to really think through how they can be part of that effort to get the planet on the trajectory toward that 50 to 52% reduction in carbon emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. And we recognize that each country has to choose its own pathways based on its strengths and its challenges to get there. But for the United States and Australia, I think as developed countries and as global leaders, we can collaborate both through increasing our global ambition to reduce carbon emissions, and also through, as we've heard Prime Minister Morrison talk on many occasions, investments in technology that can help us to provide the solutions that we need to avert the worst forms of climate change. And lastly, for Australia and the United States, along with like-minded countries, to be speaking with one voice is imperative to encourage other countries that are facing other types of challenges and perhaps more reluctant to make the hard, ambitious choices by bringing our voices together. Australia, the United States, and our like-mindeds can help bring others on board as well.
It's fantastic, and I'm sure many of our listeners and audience will be heartened to hear that it's climate security is on the agenda when our two nations talk. You mentioned targets there, Doug, and I guess I know that's very much a hot topic ahead of COP in Glasgow. So when you look at the scale of this threat, do you think that Australia's current emissions reduction targets are adequate in order to tackle this challenge?
I think that a few weeks ago, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry's deputy, Jonathan Pershing, really did a great job of addressing this question when he said it would be helpful to have Australia step forward with more ambition. But he was very clear on that point about each country has its own pathway to contributing to that to those 2030 and 2050 goals that we need to reach to avert the worst forms of the worst effects of climate change. And so for us, you know, the question is really, what are the contributions? How can Australia, as a federation, as states, as companies, and as citizens, come together to put the country on the trajectory to be meeting those goals?
Thanks, Doug. And stepping back from targets for a second, another common thread that's discussed with climate change and security is how the conflicts over water are related. Cheryl, I might throw to you now. Can you tell us more about challenges with water security and how that can spark conflict?
Well, Robert earlier has spoken about complex security problems in our near maritime region. And if you look a little further to our north, that's when you really see from Australia's perspective where there's concern over water security. Water's a fundamental human need. We can't live without water, and it's very hard to have food without water. It's essential for agriculture, among other things. And what we have stretching from the India-Pakistan border with the Indus River right through to the Yellow River in China is river systems under stress. And they're under stress for two reasons. One, the pattern of rainfall is more erratic. So we get heavier downpours, which cause flooding and damage. But also the Tibetan glacier systems and snowpack that feeds all of those rivers. So billions of people stretching from Pakistan through to China and encompassing most of Southeast Asia are reliant on those river systems, which are under stress with climate change. And while fortunately those countries have mature relationships and have done a lot to improve the water security in their regions, there's still the possibility of conflict, particularly when rivers such as the Mekong go through multiple countries, each wanting to draw its water. And there already has been earlier tension over the India-Pakistan Indus River where we've seen minor conflicts break out. And from Australia's perspective, that's really worrying because these are not just big countries. They're big countries which are our current largest trading partner in China, but also in India, a partner in the Quad dialogue between Australia, America, Japan, and India. That's one of the key security relationships in the region, but also a country where we're looking to increase and diversify our trade too, as we look across trade across a greater set of countries. So if those countries are suffering economic shocks from water security, the bets are off whether we're going to be effectively moving our trade into those spaces.
It sounds like there's some serious hard implications, particularly around trade with the water security conflicts. And Robert, I know you mentioned a little bit about food earlier, but we've had a few questions, including from Jenna, who asks, when food production and supply chains are increasingly disrupted by climate events, do you think we'll see food shortages in our own communities? And if that is the case, what can we do to build community here in Australia rather than fragmenting it?
Wow, that's a good question, Jenna. So I don't think in the short to medium term we'll see food insecurity in our region. However, having said that, certainly over the longer term, if the climate continues to warm, all bets are off. But in the short term, we will see, and actually are already seeing huge decreases in agricultural profits in communities, farms that are failing primarily because of weather shocks. There was a recent Australian Bureau of Agriculture, ABARES study that indicated that 23% there's been a 23% drop in profits over the 20 years to 2020, and big additional decreases in profits that the government's analysis suggests will happen as we move forward in a warming climate. I think also it's important to realize that already we're seeing these multiple shocks happening in communities. I'm on the board of an organization called the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and we visit communities in remote Queensland. Something like 53 of 77 of the Queensland local government areas have now had 3 or more major disasters in 3 years. Some of them have had 4, 5, and 6. So when you have these multiple shocks, communities are in a constant state of recovering and the resilience becomes eroded.
And I think that's a really interesting point around those compounding disasters. And I'm surprised to hear just how frequent that's been in Queensland. And Doug, this question comes from Rebecca, which really, I think, builds on this point that marginalised and disadvantaged communities are even more impacted by compounding events from climate change and extreme weather. How do you think equity considerations can be taken into account when addressing climate change and its broader impacts?
Well, Rebecca, I think that you're in some ways channeling President Biden when you ask that question, because his climate approach envisions protecting the planet through more equitable, healthy, and sustainable societies. So for the Biden administration's climate change approach, equitability, inclusiveness are really important elements. And for me, as someone who has been really fortunate over the last 30 years as a Peace Corps volunteer and then as a diplomat to spend time in the Pacific region, it's really great to hear. I have been to Kiribati and Tuvalu and stood on Tarawa or Funafuti on the causeways where on either side of just a few meters of land, the ocean is absolutely there and absolutely present, and everyday reminder of just how fragile existence can be in these low-lying atoll states. And then contrast that with the images coming out of New York from the recent hurricane there, with subways inundated with water, and see that this is a challenge that disproportionately impacts those that are least ready to be able to take action. And so the White House International Climate Finance Plan is a really important part of how we hope as the United States to respond to that, both domestically and internationally. Now, domestically, it includes the concept of justice in the formation of a government-wide justice initiative with the goal of distributing about 40% of certain federal benefits to disadvantaged communities. So that's looking domestically for the United States. But when we look internationally, the plan intends to double by 2024 our annual public climate financing to $5.7 billion, up from its previous peak, but also to triple the adaptation financing by 2024. So this is everything from public investment to technical assistance and long-term capacity building. And we have a new USAID climate change strategy that we intend to be released around the time of COP26. But these climate impacts, as Rebecca said, do hit the most vulnerable the hardest. And it's up to us advanced economies to be doing the hard work to try and avert these worst impacts.
And Robert and Cheryl, when you hear all of the plans that are being laid out there by Doug from a US perspective, how do you think Australia is measuring up?
After you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Robert. I think once again, Australia's started a race at the back of the pack. It doesn't mean we can't come through and ultimately do well, but I think we need to look to what America's doing, but also our other allies, in particular the UK and the EU, also NATO, which we have an observer role with. So the bad thing about that is we have some catch up to do. The good thing about that is it's a well-worn track, and the US and other countries have been very generous in offering to assist us, certainly from the defence security perspective, in getting up to scratch pretty quickly.
I think one of the surprises, the somewhat hidden surprises in the climate discussion and debate in Australia is that there's actually a lot of bipartisan support around climate adaptation work. And if you look at some major pieces of legislation that have passed Parliament recently, like the Emergency Response Fund and the Future Drought Fund, they have really significant funding for adaptation, which is not surprising because no politician wants to see farmers suffering in the news. And so there is consensus, some bipartisan support, but all of this work is still very siloed and just a small percentage of what's needed in the face of the huge challenges that are coming ahead. Fundamentally, these shouldn't be standalone pots of money. That's great, but we need to incorporate climate risk in all of our investments, social, economic investments across society, so that we're making sure we're not building hospitals in flood zones or in places that will become overwhelmed by the hazards that climate change is amplifying.
So Doug, something that you brought up a little bit earlier was that your understanding is that climate security has certainly come up in talks between our two nations. And can we expect sort of climate security to continue to take prominence in the ministerial talks that are happening this week?
Yeah, I think that the question of climate change has really suffused really every discussion, bilateral, multilateral, plurilateral, and has really been part of every sort of security discussion, at least over the last 6 months, and that the intergovernmental panel on climate change report has, as mentioned previously, has amplified that even more. So it's really hard for me to, imagine that there will be broad, deep discussions that don't somehow touch on climate change.
I'm sure that will be very welcome, as it is a critical issue. And one sort of part of this puzzle is, of course, how climate change and migration interact. And we've received a lot of questions from our audience about this. So Robert, I might throw to you. Can you tell us a bit more about how climate change will affect the flow of refugees? And also, how can Australia respond to this challenge to ensure those that are affected have choice and are allowed sort of to be able to move with dignity?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. Well, all of the disruptions we're talking about, particularly when they're happening in places that are less developed countries with weak social safety nets and the like, mean that people's lives are disrupted. And generally, we're now seeing a huge increase. We've been seeing actually for over a decade now, increasing numbers of internally displaced people, but also, even though we don't have a formal category for in international law for climate refugees, but certainly people who are moving as a result of the huge climate disruptions. So I think something like the number of internally displaced people have doubled since 2009. So it's actually a huge million, and something like 25 million of those internally displaced have been displaced by climate events, weather-related disasters. So I think the numbers are going up, and we're just at the beginning of this huge increase. Now, what does Australia do? Well, we can put up walls. We can put up walls. I was at a meeting and there was a colleague from Kiribati, a very low-lying island, a country, and Australia's refugee policy was in the news at the time. And he turned to me and he said, my country is going to disappear beneath the waves in maybe 10, 20 years. I hope when I come knocking on your door, you'll let me in. And that really hit me. It doesn't take much empathy to put yourself in that position. Imagine an Australian having to go to another country and knock on a door and say, can you please let me in? It's a hugely, profoundly disturbing image, and it's a reality for many of these countries. So I think the refugee impact from climate change will be enormous. I think what we should be doing is, of course, we have to protect Australia's interests, but one way we can do that, and probably the most effective way we can do it, is by engaging actively in our region with countries like Indonesia to help them understand or to support them to deal with the humanitarian disasters that happen, to help build their resilience through our aid program, through defense cooperation. Because if all we do is put up barriers, symbolic barriers, but in effect barriers, then I don't think the barrier will be tall enough or strong enough to protect us from the wave of immigrants and refugees.
So it's clear that the climate security challenge is one that does not adhere to national borders. In fact, it's one that seems to tear them down. So I guess what I want to get to, Cheryl, is that this is changing the way that we now understand security. It used to be about nationalism, but climate change has made this a very different concept. Can you tell us a bit more, building on Robert's point, about how we can't afford to think about security anymore in a traditional way?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Alex. And it really goes to the nub of why I think security organisations struggled initially to get to grips with climate change, because the whole practice of international relations and security is founded in this idea of nations, and the threats were coming from nations or groups of nations. Climate change is a threat that doesn't have an actor, so there's not a bad guy in climate change. So that's one way it's very different. But also it's global. We're all in lifeboat Earth, and if climate change is allowed to run riot in 1/3, 2/3 most of the planet, there are going to be very few places, if any at all, where it's going to be safe and secure, and we live the lives that we've been accustomed to. I think we've already heard throughout this session that we're interconnected as a globe. We have trade relations, the refugee flows, and if we let climate change run riot, it comes home to roost through migration or conflict or trade or lack of access to goods that Australians need to sort of live the lifestyles they're accustomed to. So really, it's a different type of problem. And that's why I'm really encouraged to see the language this year from the US at the Biden Leadership Summit about a global challenge. And I'm really encouraged with the work of John Kerry as Biden's special advisor, and also the thinking not just in Western countries, and not just in NATO and the UK and New Zealand, who are all now, I think, pretty much on board of this is a global problem with a global solution required, but also it's the language coming from China as well. They've long had a sense that this is ecological security is the most important security, and their approach, and again, like many of us, the words and practice don't always align, but their approach is conceptually aligned. So there's really, I think, good opportunity for the world to get together on this one.
So Cheryl, it's clear that other nations and international organisations are rapidly broadening that traditional notion of national security in order to address the climate security risk. And as you've mentioned, and as Doug has demonstrated, the US have been a particularly impressive leader in this space. So it's a great opportunity to dig in a bit more and look at what our allies are doing to address this challenge. So Doug, this year, Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, said, "Today, no nation can find lasting security without addressing the climate crisis. We face all kinds of threats in our line of work, but few of them truly deserve to be called existential, and the climate crisis does." Can you touch a little bit more on how the Biden administration is tackling this challenge? It's very strong words that we're hearing about the scale of it. And how do you think the Trump administration's position on climate change has set the US back when it comes to tackling this challenge?
Thanks for that, Alex. I think the fact that we're hearing from Secretary Austin is a real indication of just how intercalated this priority is throughout the United States government. The Biden administration, President Biden, has made climate change a very top priority. This is clear in the trade policy agenda he released in March this year. It's clear in the interim national security guidance, and it's clear through his appointment of the special presidential envoy for climate, John Kerry, a former senator, a former secretary of state, a member of cabinet, to take this message globally, to be doing the work of the government in climate change day in and day out. And the April Leaders Summit on Climate, convening of the Major Economies Forum are other just clear indications of the importance that President Biden has put on this issue. We talked earlier about targets, but moving from 26 to 28% global, carbon emission reduction targets to the new 50 to 52% reductions from 2005 levels are an extremely difficult political achievement in the United States and really reflect a commitment to work in all sorts of different work streams to make that happen. And none of that is politically easy in the United States either. So having those laid out, those goals laid out, I think is a really clear indication of where the president wants to go, and has backed this up with investments, both in technology and through the infrastructure bills into electric vehicle, both supply chains and support infrastructure. All of this is examples of US leadership, but we certainly can't do it alone. To your second question, I think the climate crisis and our desire to avert the worst effects of it mean that we have to look forward, that we don't have the luxury of taking our eye off of what's going to happen for the rest of this decade. And I think that polling in the United States over the last 4 years would demonstrate that citizens and companies have also been dedicated to this pretty consistently. And for decades, US policy has set out markers for industry to think about investment into future technologies like electrovoltaic batteries and electric vehicles. And industry doesn't walk back these significant investments that they've made. So there is a trajectory that has been established for decades. And what we are doing now, what we need to do now is change that inflection, change the pitch of that curve so that we can avert the worst forms or the worst effects. And I guess my last point would be to say that President Biden has also recommitted the United States to multilateral approaches to addressing climate change, not just rejoining the Paris Agreement, but by leading within organizations like G7. And I should also acknowledge the leadership that the UK in particular has provided through these organizations as well. But day in and day out, our policymakers are asking, what do we do now to avert those worst effects?
And it's clear that the momentum is very much underway in the US, despite what may have happened under the Trump administration. But what's been made clear is that Australia has fallen well behind the US, the UK, Japan, and New Zealand, and other peers in terms of how we approach this climate and security risk. So Robert, what are some of the things that you think Australia needs to do to be able to catch up and be matching the pace that we're seeing in the US and in the UK?
Wow, that's a big question. I think there's a lot we should be doing that we're not doing. And actually, there's a lot that other countries need to do that they're not doing as well. Maybe just to focus on one thing that we're hugely underestimating, and that is the fact that the climate change is a whole system change. It's not an environment issue, just an environment issue. It's not a natural disaster issue. The whole system is changing, and we're hugely underestimating that and unprepared for what that means. We're getting little hints of this now in the simultaneous disasters that are striking in Europe, in Asia, as a result of the blocking event that we saw this year. We've seen this in 2010 and 11 with the fires and drought in Russia and the extreme floods in maritime Southeast Asia. And we've seen that in Black Summer, with our own Black Summer. We had unprecedented drought, unprecedented temperatures, unprecedented fires that created its own weather, that created a biodiversity crisis, air quality crisis, and almost a water supply crisis for Sydney because Warrangamba Dam was threatened at one point. So we need to, there's some great work underway in the BOM, Bureau of Meteorology, in defense, in parts of defense, in DFAT, but it's still very siloed, very incremental. We're not understanding the risk that's coming, particularly the systemic risk. We need to start working across government coherently as a priority, and with civil society and the private sector to begin understanding the risk. If we don't understand it, we can't identify the interventions we need to make to stop the instability, to stop the people movements, or to help build the resilience of our own communities and the resilience of communities in our region.
So it's clear then that Australia needs to act rapidly and decisively on climate change in order to maintain both the collective security of our region, but also to improve collaboration across government and to get rid of those silos. And it's clear there's a number of solutions that we can use to tackle this threat. And Cheryl, a question that we're getting a lot from our audience is it sounds like there's plenty of concern in those silos across government, but also from our allies as well. So what can we do to change things in Canberra so that this issue can become a top tier priority?
Well, I think this is the sort of reverse solution to that suggested by Robert of that top-down planned approach to understanding risk. There's also a requirement for a bottom-up movement, and we're seeing in Australia, we've seen communities, local governments, councils, states, business, farmers, farming groups, many groups in civil society really begin to act, and they're looking for somewhere to contribute into government. And I'm constantly amazed, given the modern technologies we have to connect people. I'm almost demonstrating one of them here today. We now have much greater ability to bring information together and people together, to have conversations and work on solutions to climate change. And certainly, I don't think it no longer cuts the mustard to have one election every 3 years and say that that's settled the way forward for Australia. I think there needs to be much more involvement of citizens in and local government and communities in Australia's climate solutions. So for everyone out there listening, if you haven't been to your local council, don't know your local areas or state's climate change plan, get involved with a local group, and also get engaged if there's a Voices of group in your electorate, because that's the way you can send messages and get engaged in the solution. Otherwise, it will be imposed upon you.
It's a good call to action there, Cheryl, and I'm sure many of our audience will take you up on that idea. I want to take us again quickly to the Pacific as we talk about these solutions. And Doug, as you mentioned, you spent quite a bit of time in the Pacific Island countries, which have a very unique perspective on the climate crisis. What do you think Pacific Island countries want to see from countries like Australia and the US? And can the US work with Pacific Island countries to drive that global ambition that you've talked about to reduce emissions?
Yeah, I think, Alex, that the Pacific Islands and small island developing states globally are coming from a very unique position, and that there are a couple of things that they're really interested in. First and foremost is for the developed nation to seriously tackle this issue, to be having the really hard discussions, to be making hard choices, and to be dedicating the resources to achieving outcomes. I think that they want us to be present, and they want to be present in these discussions and have their voices heard, and to be able to tell the stories of how their cultures, their islands, their citizens are impacted by the various aspects, whether it's rising ocean levels or increased severe weather events, and then being able to tap into the kinds of financing that will enable them to adapt is really also very high on the agenda for many of these countries. But I don't. I feel like they would be much better and more eloquent voices for their desires than I will be, but let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Doug. And Robert or Cheryl, did you have any thoughts in particular in relation to the Pacific and what you think Australia should be doing to help our neighbours and our allies in the face of this challenge ahead of COP?
In the challenge ahead of COP? Well, the thing the Pacific Islands countries want more than anything is more ambitious action to reduce greenhouse gases, because any support we provide to help them adapt to climate change, our efforts will be overwhelmed by the scale of the hazards that strike, whether it's cyclone, sea level rise, saltwater inundation, and depletion of fresh water, and actually the disappearance of countries under the waves, as my colleague from Kiribati said. So what they would like, and actually we have a shared interest, Australia has a shared interest with Pacific Island countries in doing this because we're so exposed to the hazards. We're already a very dry country, and with flooding and drought as part of it's in our bones, but not on the scale of what's now ahead of us. And so it is in our interest, even if we're not a major contributor, at least in terms of our own CO2 emissions, to warming, it's absolutely in our interest to urge other countries that are major contributors to increase their ambition, because if that doesn't happen, we are going to get pummeled. So I think we are absolutely on the same page, or at least in terms of our exposure and concern, on the same page with our Pacific Island neighbors.
Thanks, Robert. And Cheryl, did you have anything else to add on the Pacific piece?
I think Robert's really hit it. It's, if we're a leader, we have power when we speak to the region. We have creds because of what we're doing. And even though we do invest quite a bit in capacity building and supporting resilience and adaptation, it just doesn't cut it if we lack the ambition as we currently do on the root cause of climate change and don't get those CO2 emissions down.
Well, we're nearly at time. It has been a very complex, fascinating, and it's sometimes worrying conversation as we look at the scale of this challenge. But I want to leave us on an optimistic note. So finally, a question for each of our panelists to conclude the evening. It's obviously been a year of challenges for the globe and for Australia, but what reasons do we have to be hopeful? And Doug, I might ask that question of you first.
Well, thanks. I think we've got actually, for as many reasons as we have to be worried, we also have some really great reasons to be optimistic. And let me conclude with just 3 of them. First, I'm really excited about the actions being taken at state, local, and rural levels to begin to, based on local communities, take action toward climate change and set goals for emissions reductions on a subnational level. I think that kind of action, that kind of activity, that citizen action that Cheryl talked about is really exciting and a great source of optimism. Second, on the business side, I'm really excited at the way that shareholders, stakeholders, customers, and even employees are driving companies to change the way that they do business and driving companies to really think through the carbon transition and how they are going to change their business models to adapt to a world that is going to change just by the things that have been done over recent decades and centuries. So the fact that the investors are changing the way that capital flows, I think, is really interesting and really encouraging. And then lastly, I'm encouraged because we are increasingly seeing one of the greatest areas of resistance to climate change action has been, what do we do about those communities that are invested in previous technologies? And I think we're starting to see some really good examples of countries or states or communities that have been able to, by thinking strategically and making interventions early in the process, have been able to cushion the impact on communities through training, through creating alternatives for employment, or through refocusing energies and investment. And when we think of Texas, I think we all think of fossil fuels. It's hard to imagine, maybe I'm too old, and reflecting back on the days of Dallas and J.R. Ewing and the big hats associated with oil. But now for the United States, Texas is the largest producer of renewable energy, contributing 21% of energy in Texas. So if that is not a demonstration that communities are learning how to shift, I don't know what it is. What is, and that makes me so optimistic. So thank you.
That leaves us with a lot to be hopeful for. I didn't know that about Texas, but it sounds like moving the money and rapid innovation is something that can leave us very hopeful. Robert, I might throw to you next.
Ooh, don't want to, it's always hard to be the last one in this, Cheryl, so, but I'm sure you have some. Well, at the top of my reason for being optimistic is this unprecedented global energy transformation that's underway from fossil fuels to renewables. And what that means is that basically we have a mechanism that will accelerate climate action faster than anything, which is the profit motive, because energy renewables are just now competitive against not only new coal, for example, but even existing coal-fired plants. So that in itself is an enormous, huge transformation that's happening. Governments, politicians and governments could accelerate that even more with the right policy settings, and that piece is missing. But I'm hugely optimistic about that transition. Secondly, I'm optimistic because as Doug mentioned, but maybe to take a slightly different angle on this, venture capital, financial controllers, financial managers, the financial community more generally is basically already now detecting, in asset managers like BlackRock, is the largest in the world, is already detecting the climate signal in their investments. So what that means is they're moving, literally it will be trillions of dollars away from fossil fuel assets and from companies and organizations that rely on fossil fuels, and away from towards renewables, and also away from hazards, assets that are exposed to climate hazards, to ones that are more resilient. That's going to be transformational. And the third reason I'm optimistic is because I'm actually a bit pessimistic, because I think that as we have more of these major Black Summer events, which we will increasingly now, and I think we're underestimating how rapidly that will happen, the politics, it will be, the impacts will be unavoidable, and people will see that, the politics will respond to that. It's already happening across Australia and across the world, and that will help bring about this transformation as well.
It's a lot to be hopeful for, and we're going to give you the final word, Cheryl. Leave us with a message of hope. Why are you feeling optimistic?
Well, I'm actually going to use my privilege of going last to take a slightly different tack. I find hope is one of those words that often doesn't lead to action. Like, I hope climate change gets better. So what really excites me is actions and opportunities. And like our two previous speakers, Doug and Robert, I see amazing things happen. And what really excites me is communities that have got to that systems change that Robert was speaking about, and have really rethought sustainable economies and sustainable agriculture and regenerative economy. So not only are we remaking and solving the climate problem, but we're remaking the world that can be a fairer, more equitable place, a cleaner place, more healthy to bring up kids, a place that values the environment and values Indigenous people's custodianship of the environment. So it's everything before us. To solve this problem, we have to solve a whole lot of problems that have been intractable. And this gives us the opportunity to move forward in so many ways. So I think it's really the action. It's the action happening everywhere that I think encourages and gives you a sense that you can get through this, and we can get through this.
Strong words to leave us with, Cheryl. Thank you. And thank you to the hundreds of people who've joined us this evening, and to everyone who sent in such thought-provoking questions. And of course, a big thanks to all our supporters whose donations power our work and enable us to host events like these. We really couldn't do it without you. If you want to read the Climate Council's security report that we discussed tonight, you can just check out the link below that we'll provide in the comment section. If there are bits you've missed, don't worry. The recording of this webinar will be emailed to those who registered and will be available on our YouTube channel. A big thanks also to the teams behind the scenes who I've seen fielding questions and who made tonight possible. Please stay tuned for more webinars like these from the Climate Council, and stay safe.
Thanks, Alex.